So hello there. Welcome to the Sensory Friendly Classroom, in person or at home. My name is Christine Rogers and I am an occupational therapist for the Shandy Clinic, and we are so grateful that we get to be joining you today. As I said, I work for the Shandy Clinic, which is a pediatric outpatient therapy clinic that offers occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, as well as ABA services and multidisciplinary autism evaluations. We have 11 clinic locations up and down the Front Range of Colorado, and we've got some really awesome services there. Everything from feeding therapy to aquatic therapy to animal assisted therapy. Some great things going on. So if you have any interest in learning more about us, here is our information. You can give us a call or find out more from our website at shandyclinic.com. So today I'm speaking to those of you who are in early childhood education, and you guys probably know better than the rest of us just how much life has changed this past year due to coronavirus. Coronavirus has undoubtedly changed the context of the classroom environment. From everything from just new routines we're experiencing. How do we load and unload from the carpool line? What routes do we take to avoid cross-contamination? And then we have things like reduced support services, eating in classrooms, wearing masks, incessant washing of hands, and hand sanitizing. So yes, preschool and the likes are looking very different than they ever have before. However, some things are not changing at all. In fact, some things are staying very much the same. We know that we are in a unique window in those first 3 years of life that simply does not compare with the neurological development that happens at any other point in life. In those first 3 years, we see that reflected in size. As you can see from this graph here, at age 3, the child's brain is already 80% of what size it's going to be as an adult. 80%. Is that not amazing? But that's also reflected not only in the size of the brain, but how much the brain is learning. So we can see that reflected in just that neurodevelopment growth. We see that there are more neurons developing, more synapses developing. The strength of the communication between those neurons is so much stronger. And these are crucial years for building some really important foundational blocks. We see them listed here: numbers, social skills, symbols, language, vision, habits, hearing, emotional control, and motor development. And so those of you who I'm speaking to today who are working with these young individuals in our society are doing incredibly important jobs. But what that means is while we are in the midst of experiencing coronavirus, a year for many of us, it feels like life has just simply been put on hold. Your life and your jobs cannot. It is so important that these little kiddos, that their learning is not put on hold. This season is far too critical for their development to waste a single moment of it. And with that being said, that is our hope today, is to figure out how do we facilitate the learning process the most. And yes, we want to touch on how this could look if your child is learning from home or if they're learning in a classroom with new challenges, but we want this to be able to carry us past coronavirus as well. So we're going to be talking today about what is sensory processing. Some of you may have a general understanding, but we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to understanding what neurologically is happening, what's happening in the body. Then 2, how do I know if a child in my classroom has sensory processing challenges? So once I figure out what it means, how do I know if this kiddo has it? And then of course 3, what can I do to help it as their classroom teacher, their therapist, their support staff, and the like. So I'd like to start off by asking you, what do you think sensory looks like in your classroom? When you think of the word sensory, what maybe comes to mind? For some of you, it might be something a bit like these pictures here on the slide. Some kiddos who are jumping up on their desk, constantly getting out of their seat, sitting in kind of awkward positions. These are the kiddos who are playing with those brand new masks over and over again all day long, stretching those ear bands, pulling, snapping them, readjusting them constantly. These are the kiddos who need directions repeated 3 times before comprehending. What was that you said? These are the kiddos who consistently struggle with standing in line or bumping into others, leaning against the walls, walking on their tiptoes, constantly fidgeting, maybe falling out of chairs, hiding under tables. This is the kiddo who's asking for probably 6 trips to the bathroom in one class period, or who might be labeled with different struggles, like struggles with reading, maybe labeled a klutz, might be falling behind academically, or be labeled as a behavioral kid, a distracted kid, maybe even just an awkward kid. That is what often sensory gets described to look like in these little kiddos. So as I said, we're going to be jumping in first to describing what is sensory. And so we're going to start off by thinking about the brain. Over 80% of the nervous system is involved in processing or organizing sensory input, and thus the brain is primarily a sensory processing machine. So I don't know about you all, but when I think of the brain, the first things that I think of it being responsible for are not usually sensory processing. I think of it as being responsible for learning, for language, for maybe processing some emotions, maybe some motor development. But sensory is often something that escaped my mind. But if this quote by Dr. A. Gene Ayers, who was basically the founder of sensory integration and sensory processing disorder, if this is true and 80% of our nervous system is involved in processing sensory input, do you think that it might have an impact on how we learn, how we process emotions, how we communicate, how we walk or catch a ball or use our handwriting? Absolutely. So if there are disruptions in any way to the brain that processes sensory information, we will also expect disruptions in these other areas. Let me break it down a bit more. So this is one of my favorite pictures to basically stretch out what on paper is happening in this sensory processing process. So when you and I think of the senses, we probably think of the 5 senses that we learned in elementary school. We think about hearing, we think about smelling, we think about touching, we think about seeing, we think about tasting. And all of those things would be true. You'll find out today that there are also a few other hidden senses that our body's bringing in. But we're receiving this information from the environment. I like to think of it a lot like a game of telephone. Do you remember that game of telephone where you have a cup on one end and then a cup on the other, and there's a string connecting the two? And so maybe your sister or your friend has one end of the telephone, and then you're in the other room with the other end, and you guys communicate little messages back and forth to each other, and it's amazing. It works just like a telephone. But then there was the other game of telephone where you sat around in a circle with all your friends and you turned and whispered a little message, something funny to the person next to you, and then they go from person to person to person, all whispering the same message, and by the end you've got some absolutely hilarious, nothing like the original message. The nervous system is like we're taking those 2 games of telephone and combining them together. So this ear, this nose, these fingers, these eyes, these mouths that are in the pictures, that is our first cup. And when it receives that initial information, that initial message, then it takes that string or those neurons over to the spinal cord, and this is where it's going to hit the next cup and say, this message now needs to come on up to the brain, and the brain will detect it. That message does a little knock, knock, knock on the door of the brain and says, is this worth registering? And the brain decides whether it's going to let it in or not. There, in the brain, is where the brain has an important job of organizing this sensory information. So it says, what am I going to do with it? And the brain primarily has 3 jobs that it's doing with that sensory information. 1, it's integrating it. 2, it's modulating it. And 3, it's doing some discrimination. So what does that mean? Integration is when one or more sensory systems connect up in the brain. So what's happening here is I just heard a loud door slam, and what is my response going to be? I'm going to turn to look, right? So I'm integrating my auditory system with my visual system to say, that was just not enough information for me to hear that loud noise. I need to gather a little bit more information to identify how I should respond. So I'm going to bring in that vision. Then we have modulation. Modulation is the regulation of sensory input. It tells our brain, hey, you need to pay attention to this, or don't worry about that. So you're probably doing quite a bit of modulation right now. The auditory system is saying, I'm going to be paying attention to what I hear on the screen or in my ear pods or whatever. But it's probably also turning down the volume on a lot of other auditory input you have in your background environment, possibly the hum of your computer or the hum of your car, maybe the air conditioning in the background, maybe some people a few offices over, your kids in another room. All of those other background noises, as we often call them, is your brain saying, I hear them, but they're not getting the majority of my attention. And then the last thing is discrimination. So this is being able to tell the difference between two types of stimuli based off of some past experiences I've had. So it might be able to tell me, how fast am I moving? How tight are my shoes? Have I heard this song before? And this is based off of, I know my shoes are too tight because I tied them this tight a couple months ago and my feet were really uncomfortable. In fact, my feet looked a little purplish when I took my shoes off. Or I know that car is coming closer based off of the noise getting louder, and I've seen this before, so when I hear it getting closer, I know I need to get out of the way. So I bet in each of these examples, integration, modulation, discrimination, you can see where if there was some breakdown in some of these processes, we might have some problems. Someone struggled with integration. It could probably be a child who might appear a little clumsy. My hands just don't catch the ball at the right time when it's coming towards me. Or maybe I seem a little aloof. When you tell me to put the yellow piece on top of the green piece, I don't automatically apply that auditory information to the visual pieces in front of my desk. I'd do better if maybe you're right there and you can show me. If there's a little difficulty with modulation, that kiddo is having a really hard time just drowning out the hum of the projector. They're listening to the teacher, but when those kiddos are talking at the desk next to them or that projector's making some noises, man, that is getting all of their attention. There's a child who struggles with discrimination. This might be the kiddo who doesn't get out of the way of the moving car, or possibly pushes down way harder than they need to on their pencil, even though it breaks the lead every single time they do it, or even though they've rubbed the eraser hole right through that paper every time. So these are some examples that we start to see of what sensory processing disorder might look like. And so the last stage of the sensory processing system is output. And just like any good game of telephone, you get around that circle and you find out, okay, what was the final message that was heard by the last person? And we get to compare it to the original and all laugh over how they compare. The output is much like that final message that determines, was the process that got us here working or not working? And so similarly, our brain and our body is receiving all of this information from the environment. Our brain is organizing and deciding how should we respond to it, and then our bodies do the physical responding. So an example of this might be, I just heard that loud slam of the door. My brain told me, whew, that was a little bit louder than it needed to be. I should use my eyes, turn and look and see who's there. And then based off of what my eyes and ears are putting together in information, then my body decides, okay, how do I need to respond? If it's somebody who's threatening, then I might need to jump up and be ready in startle mode to be able to defend myself, to get that person out of there. But if it's someone who I see a bunch of times and maybe they just accidentally push the door a little too hard on their way in, then I know, oh, it's nobody. It's just my friend, or it's just my sibling, and I can just go back to feeling relaxed, no problem. When there is an issue in how our body is organizing and receiving this information, then we might not give the appropriate response to the circumstance at hand. Does that make sense? So we're going to keep going with this, but when we talked about how 80% of the nervous system is responsible for processing sensory input, these these adaptive responses that we see here on this slide are the remaining 20%. These are the motor movements that we're looking at, the emotional processes, the language, the communication, the words that come out, and the learning. Carol Stock-Kranowitz, who wrote a wonderful book called The Out of Sync Child, says sensory processing disorder is difficulty in the way the brain takes in, organizes, and uses sensory information, causing a person to have problems interacting effectively in the everyday environment. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what is sensory processing. We know how that process is working between the body and the brain and our responses. But now we're going to move into how do I know if a child has sensory processing challenges? And we've given a few examples that you might already be having little light bulbs going off going, oh, what about this kiddo? Oh, I've seen that in that kiddo. But we're going to help you a little bit more be able to identify exactly what's going on, which area is there a breakdown with that child, and how then eventually what can we do to help. So we're going to start off with our sensory questionnaire. This is a very brief questionnaire that is attached here in the resources for you. And it will take you a few minutes to complete, but I just want you to complete this on one child. So that child who you have been thinking of probably the most during this presentation thus far, go ahead and take a few minutes to answer this questionnaire on them. Okay, so if you're going, okay, so I filled out the questionnaire. Now, what is this telling me? It's something like this. My husband and I had some friends over the other night, and they were raving about this experience they had with a nutritionist they started seeing. The nutritionist was able to give them some lab tests, and from the results, they were able to see that they were deficient in calcium, iron, and zinc. So they were telling them naturally you need to eat a lot more foods with those vitamins and minerals. But from this set of lab tests, they also found that they were allergic to lactose and sensitive to gluten. Our friends were enthusiastic, telling us how much better they felt and how much weight they had lost after they changed their diet to include more of the foods that their body needed and reduce the foods that their body couldn't handle. Taking the time to figure out how your student's body processes the sensory information that is constantly coming in from the environment around them is crucial, because it tells us as their caregivers or as their teachers how we need to shape their diet, if you will, their environment, their interactions, how we teach them. Our friends who went to this dietitian said that he had been experiencing stomach issues, stomach pains, and different just difficulties with losing weight and gaining weight had been going on for years. If they had continued to eat the diet they were previously having and just hoping for different results, I'm just really hoping that these stomach issues will go away, maybe even taking a few stomach antacids or medications to try to help, do you think that it would have helped if their body was just saying, you know what, you just can't handle these certain foods, or you know what, you're just not giving your body enough of these vitamins and minerals that they're really needing? No, they would not have probably seen the changes that they were needing. In the same way, your student's body is likely craving or deprived of certain sensory input, and they're probably hypersensitive, or if we wanted to equate it to this example, allergic to certain sensory input. So while we continue to place them in the same environment day in and day out without changing things, we won't be successful. Once we have gathered the required information from our assessment or our lab results, if you will, then we can start to create something called a sensory diet. And this will help our children and our students to become the most successful. So we're going to begin with an overview of our 7 senses. The first 2 in this box might be new to you, the proprioceptive sense and the vestibular sense. And we're going to dive into all 7 of these areas, but particularly want you to pay attention to the first 2 that are in this red box. Proprioceptive and vestibular are probably the 2 that you've heard the least about, and yet probably the ones that we as occupational therapists rely on the most in our sensory diets. There are going to be some amazing keys that can help you unlock great success in your classrooms from those kiddos who just have a little bit of an extra difficult time with paying attention or regulating their emotions or learning. So we're going to dive in deep, starting with the proprioceptive sense. So the proprioceptive sense is responsible for knowing where our body is in space. So if you think of the ears as being responsible for hearing, the eyes as being responsible for seeing, the nose is responsible for smelling, our proprioceptive receptors are hidden in our joints, in our muscles, in our skin. This is giving us information constantly on where our body is in space. So as you're sitting or as you're standing right now, your proprioceptive receptors are telling your body, am I secure? Am I safe where I'm sitting? Do I need to put more information or more attention into thinking about how I'm sitting and making sure that I'm upright in this chair? Or is that able to just kind of fall to the background and know I'm safe, I'm secure, and I can just focus instead on whatever task is in front of me, listening to this talk or writing the notes that I'm jotting down. If a child is not processing this information as needed, then they're going to have more difficulty with those activities that you or I might think of as just kind of second nature. We don't even think about where our body is in space when we're doing them. So things probably like walking, cutting paper, writing, fastening buttons. And so a kiddo who is seeking this input might be viewed as a little bit clumsier, kind of maybe has messy handwriting, or the kiddo who just seems to rush through their work and it's just a little bit sloppy. This is often the kiddo that gets the label as being a little bit clumsy, might seem to just be lazy, like dragging themselves along the wall when they're walking down the hallway instead of walking in the middle of the hallway like everybody else. But often these kiddos are also seeking more proprioceptive input because they're looking for, give me more information so I know where my body is in space. So again, as I said, I'm sitting in this chair right now and I'm not really worried about whether I'm sitting upright or not because I know that I'm comfortable here. I know that I'm secure here. If I'm not registering that proprioceptive input as I ought to be, then I'm probably both forearms on the table, hunched over, maybe even arm splayed out on the desk, side of my head on the desk, just to be able to get more proprioceptive input to know my body is safe in this spot. As I describe that position, a few of you may have students that come directly to mind. A lot of these kiddos, when they're sitting on the floor for circle time, they're sitting in that W sit that we all cringe when we look at because we think, oh, heavens, my knees. But for these kiddos, they're just seeking more input. And side note, when you do see kiddos sitting in that W sit, it really is important to encourage them to get out of that position because it really does have a terrible impact on their knee development. It will affect those joints later in life. But what their body is telling you is, I'm looking for more of that proprioceptive input to feel secure in where I am right now. I don't feel comfortable or confident just sitting here in crisscross applesauce or just sitting on my knees, I want more input. So getting the child to put both knees together and possibly putting a little bit more input on their hand and leaning a little bit on their hand are other ways that you can give them more of that proprioceptive input but protect their knees a little bit. So these kids, again, they're seeking for more proprioceptive input to feel comfortable, to feel confident. Some ways that they might seek out that input might look like behaviors that we would be tempted to reprimand them for. So kiddos who are playing just too rough, who are pushing, who are pulling, who are throwing themselves to the ground, who are lunging at the walls or scraping their shoulders against the walls the whole time they are walking down the hallway. Kiddos who walk like they have 100 pounds gained on them just because they're walking with such force. Kiddos who, when you go to hug them, they seek the deepest, squeeziest bear hugs that you can give. So these kiddos are often kind of labeled as sometimes being clumsy or a little bit sloppy, but they're often also can be labeled as just rough or behavioral, things like that. So if the proprioceptive sense is responsible for knowing where our body is in space, the vestibular sense is responsible for knowing how our body is moving through space. It's housed in the inner ear, and it's based off of some little stones that are telling us how our head is moving and where it's positioned. Our vestibular sense is often what we think of when we think of getting on that Gravitron ride at the amusement park where you're thrown against the walls. Any type of spinning, any type of going upside down. We're using it every time we just change our head position, though, really. If we just tilt our head back to wash our hair, that's our vestibular sense that's getting activated. And so kiddos who are seeking this input, who aren't registering it to the same degree that is necessary just for normal day life, but are needing a little bit more to feel like they're in a stable spot, they are going to seek out this input. So they're the kiddos who are going to be repeatedly spinning, jumping, moving all over the place. They're going to kind of maybe be labeled as your thrill seekers. The kiddos who are avoiding this input may often be labeled as kind of cautious, nervous kiddos. They would probably want to avoid the playgrounds, have a tendency to be really slow moving, just a little bit fearful, checking everything out. Sometimes as they get older, they can be known as being sedentary, lazy, kind of prefer the activities that allow them to just sit on the couch, because we're just uncomfortable with being around anything that's moving. If I register that input at too high of a level, then I'm constantly feeling insecure. So even getting on an elevator or getting on an escalator can be a scary experience. The interesting thing about the vestibular system is that it has interconnections with almost every other part of the brain. So it has an enormous influence on things like emotions, digestion, and learning. So our tactile sense is, responsible for touch. It is the largest sensory system in our body because it's housed in all of our skin. It is the first sensory system to develop in utero, and it's basically constantly telling us when we've touched something and helping us identify what it is we've touched. There are 4 primary messages that are constantly being communicated from our skin to our brain, and that is light touch, deep pressure, pain, and temperature. So it's our tactile sense that's telling us that bite of pizza we just had was way too hot. We need to wait a little bit. It's telling us that our favorite blanket is the softest because it has that fuzz just the way we like it. It helps us reach into our backpack and find what it is that we need without looking for it, like finding our keys in our purse or pulling out our wallet. Tactile seeker is going to be a kiddo who looks for the tickles, loves the back rubs, needs to touch everything in sight, is constantly seeking out messy experiences. When they're eating pasta, it is all over their face, all over their hands, and they are enjoying every second of it. Sometimes these are kiddos who rub at or bite their skin excessively, especially when they get nervous. These can also be kiddos who have really high temperature tolerances. So they can come out of the bathtub looking like a lobster, not recognizing that that temperature was way too hot. This can get to a point where it can be dangerous when a kiddo gets burned just because they didn't realize how close they were to the burner. They didn't have those alerts going off when they got close to the burner and felt the warmth, just because they weren't registering it like you or I would. And sometimes these are kiddos who can just get too close to others. They can annoy their friends or their family members because they're constantly wanting to be touched, constantly wanting to be right in your face because they like that type of constant tactile input, so wouldn't you? A tactile avoider, on the other hand, is going to look like a child who responds really negatively to light touch, hates having their hair brushed, hates having their teeth brushed, nails cut. Often these are kiddos who are excessively ticklish. When you just brush by them by walking by or putting a shirt on them, they feel like you're trying to tickle them and they don't like it. Sometimes these are kiddos who make a really big deal over small, painful experiences. Or when you go to kiss them, they rub it off. They really would prefer a deep hug or some type of deep pressure because that light touch is just too much and I don't like it. The auditory sense is, again, responsible for hearing. There we go. We're getting into those senses we're a little bit more familiar with. It works with our brain for modulation. These are some of the examples we were giving before. It helps us know which sounds we can tune out and which ones we need to tune into. So I often use it as an example of a volume dial. We know that sound of the projector or that sound of the air conditioning unit, I can turn down the dial on that and I can turn up the dial on my teacher's voice. It also works with discrimination to figure out where is the sound coming from. Is it getting closer to me? How do I need to respond accordingly? And it also helps us to make sense out of the verbal information of our environment, to hear the teacher's directions and to be able to carry them out, to remember them and carry them out. So this is what helps a child tell if something's too loud, recognize familiar voices, pay attention and accurately interpret the teacher or the parent's instructions, hear when that car's coming closer to them in the parking lot, hear mom's voice in the midst of a crowded grocery store, all of those things. The auditory seeker is going to look like, put me in the middle of the action. I want all the noises, all the crowds, all of the activity. They want to turn that volume up. They sometimes will make their own noisy sounds just to because they enjoy the sound so much. And they're often the kiddos who are constantly needing to be reminded to use an inside voice, or we don't make that sound right now during quiet reading time, things like that. An auditory avoider is going to look like, oh no, we are on the edge. We listen to every sound, and so we can be really easily distracted when a friend is talking near us or a new fan is on, or all of those things that for you or I might be background noise can be really distracting to them. Sometimes they can almost respond to just ordinary noises like flushing a toilet or a beep on a phone with a whole body startle response. Often our learning and our language development and our social interactions are connected with this auditory system, and so we can see those areas have some impairment when we have difficulty with auditory processing. The visual system is responsible for what we see, but it is also responsible for so much more. It's also responsible for visual motor skills, which allow us to take in information and then move our hands and bodies as needed in response, as well as visual perceptual skills, which help us to focus on what we need to see and disregard what we don't, notice the similarities and differences. It's the brain interpreting what we're seeing instead of just the eyes visually, the acuity, how clear we're seeing. So practically speaking, How is it being used in daily life? A visual system is helping a child find the right puzzle piece when they're completing a puzzle, helping them follow along while they're reading or completing a worksheet, copying a letter from the board, or writing their letters on the lines with the appropriate sizing, with the appropriate shape, and the appropriate direction. A kiddo who is seeking that visual input will often be a kiddo who is clamoring for excessive time in front of screens. They're attracted to bright, flickering lights. They love watching sometimes the fan spin, or love repeatedly moving the wheels on cars, just craving more of that visual stimulation. A kiddo who is avoiding visual input will try to get away from that as much as possible. So they might be really disliking bright lights, reflections, shiny surfaces. They might be the kiddos who cover their eyes and get overwhelmed whenever they go outside because that sun is just so bright. Or they might be disturbed by moving objects, like things in a busy environment, lots of other kiddos running around because it's just too much visual input. And the olfactory and oral system are going to be combined because they significantly influence one another. Smell and taste. I think we all have had experience with that. Smell is unique because its messages are directly processed through the limbic system. So before they're processed in other parts of the brain, they're processed where our memories and our emotions are processed. And that's why sometimes the smell of a certain cologne can remind you of a loved one or your dad, but then the smell of maybe a certain food can bring back another memory that is not nearly as pleasant. Practically speaking, the olfactory system helps a child determine if the cookies are burnt before they're out of the oven. They help you figure out whether the milk has gone sour before taking a sip, whether it's time to take a shower or use some deodorant. The gustatory system, or the taste, the oral, is what helps a child experience a variety of flavors, develop preferences. So our seekers are going to look like, give me more. I want more flavor, more intense smells. They might even be seeking out, trying to smell everything, things that you would think would not have a smell, pencils, erasers, sticky notes, because they're just constantly looking for that input. They might taste everything, putting things in their mouths that are not food, just because I'm looking for that taste input, that oral input. Our avoiders are often disgusted by odors. They might respond with really intense emotions or sometimes headaches. And they might resist anything but bland foods. A lot of times these are our pickiest eaters because I just am so overwhelmed by the taste of that food. So we've gotten into what is sensory processing. We've talked a little bit about how do I know if a child in my classroom or in my family has sensory processing challenges. And our last is, what can I do to help? And this is where I really want to spend the majority of our time today, because I think now you can kind of get a good sense of, okay, does this child possibly have some challenges that I'm seeing? I've filled out this questionnaire. I've listened to some of what these challenges could look like in day-to-day life. But now what do I do to be able to help that child when they have those challenges? And so we've broken down that into 4 areas. 1 is routines, 2 is beneficial breaks, 3 is seated positioning, and 4 is sensory strategies. So we're going to begin with routines, and you might be thinking, routines, I came to get some good sensory strategies. Talk to me about weighted lap pads and weighted vests and headphones. We're starting with routines because kiddos who have challenges with processing sensory input are extremely overstimulated or are constantly seeking input. So they are always on this seesaw of life that is off balance. They're always on one end or the other. And so in an environment that feels super unpredictable, and I don't know whether I am going to be totally overwhelmed by my environment or totally seeking out more every day, these kiddos are looking for give me some predictability. So I always say routines allow for an element of predictability in an unpredictable world. Research shows that an element of routine in everyone's day helps cue the brain for what to expect next. And I'm imagining that most of you probably have some sort of rhythm or routine to your days, whether it's what time you wake up in the morning, how you often start your workday, a bedtime routine that kind of cues your body and your brain that it's time to go to sleep. Kids need this too. However, it's a double-edged sword because we also know as much as we want to give routine, that the world doesn't operate within just predictability or routine. There are elements of every day that have to be new, have to be different. There's going to be new subjects to cover in school. There's going to be new learning styles that we have to introduce. There's specials that might be changing from day to day. So how do we make the changes that are happening in every day more manageable, more predictable? Well, we do this by building predictability and control into the chaos, if you will. So we start the day with the same routine. We end the day with the same routine. We possibly transition throughout the day with the same routine. So here's a little example of this morning routine for this child. He takes his chair down, he hangs up his backpack, and he puts his name tag on every day in the same way. And a lot of you probably have similar patterns that you've established in your work or your kiddos' school days. Those things are so helpful to just cue the brain. I know that I'm no longer at home. I know I'm no longer in carpool line. I know that it's time for me to start my day. Yeah, it's just kind of a cue, if you will. This is one of my favorites because I love, especially if you're working one-on-one with a kiddo and maybe a therapy session, or if that kiddo is at home, use pictures of the kiddo. They love seeing their own pictures up there. And I love that this picture is interchangeable because it shows that you can switch it out. So, and involve the kiddo in that process. If you know that your schedule is going to look a little bit different that day, then have them add in what's going to be coming. This is just as important at home as it is in the school day. So I wanted to touch on for kiddos who are either doing NTI for their early childhood education, they're just choosing to stay home during this time. It is still really powerful tool to teach those parents to be using routines to help bring some structure, some predictability, and some order to those kiddos' days. So at the Shandy Clinic, throughout COVID, we've been creating bi-weekly resources to just help our families get through this time, give them tips and tricks. And so one of the earlier resources we created was this toddler pre-K and school age daily schedule. So just teaching parents the importance of come up with a kind of rhythm to each day that your child knows, okay, we don't just have a day off of school. We're still going to be doing some beneficial things. They might look a little different than they did at school, but we're still going to make sure that we get some time to work on our letters, some time to work on music, some time to work on gross motor activities. And I think for a lot of parents, I know at least for myself, it provides an element of sanity just to know, okay, here's the sequence we're going through in the day. With my kiddo, and that's who's in the picture there, we make we draw little pictures on sticky notes, and I draw out what I would like to get done for the morning and then allow him to put them in the order that he wants them in. So he gets that element of control. He can choose which order, but I'm obviously picking what needs to get done. And so that's just been a helpful tool for us and for a lot of families as they're working at home. If you want any of these resources, it's on our website at the Shandy Clinic under the tab Resources. So next we're going to be going to beneficial breaks. And a lot of your schools might be terming these as brain breaks. Evidence shows that your brain cycles from the highest attention to the lowest attention every 90 minutes, and that's called an ultradian rhythm. You can only maintain focus for about 90 to 120 minutes before it needs to rest and give itself a reboot, if you will. I would imagine for kiddos who are in early childhood education, those first 3 years of life, we're talking a lot shorter. So when we give our body movement breaks during those times, it essentially is allowing our brain to turn back on. It's rebooting. Exercise or movement allows our brains to turn on the prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain that's responsible for planning, organization, focus, working memory, evaluating consequences, learning from mistakes. It's basically those executive functioning skills. But for kids who are developing, these breaks are even more critical. In the book Spark by John Ratey, he speaks on the power of exercise for unleashing the potential of the brain. They reference a study which was completed in a low-income school in inner city Charleston, South Carolina. And as a trial, the school set up 8 different stations and had each student begin their day with 30 minutes of fun, high-intensity exercise, doing double dutch jump rope, basketball, pogo sticks, hula hoop, things like that. Within 4 months, they saw an 83% drop in discipline problems. And that just speaks to the power of getting that brain moving. Again, if we go back to the sensory pieces of this, those brains were getting a lot of proprioceptive input and a lot of vestibular input to start their day, so that they're already starting feeling grounded and secure and helping their brains to be ready to sit and learn. So again, where are we going to get the most bang for our buck during these breaks? It's going to be when we are able to provide proprioceptive and vestibular input. So anytime we can give that kiddo an opportunity to get some deep pressure input, some jumping, some maybe doing wall push-ups, some stomping our feet, and some vestibular input, changing the positioning of our head, moving all around, and maybe doing some jumps in a circle or spinning. All of those things are going to kind of awaken the brain and help us feel grounded so that we're able to sit and learn again. Some activities that can help provide some opportunities to be able to give that proprioceptive or vestibular input would include some of these classroom jobs and break time activities. Classroom jobs are a great way to kind of build up the confidence of that child. I see you. I really need your help. You're speaking to the individual and saying, can you be my special helper to help me erase or wash the chalkboard, to wash off these desks and tables, to carry a box of books, or push this big heavy stack of chairs I have, or even the single chair. Can you help me rearrange these bookshelves? Open this door, staple some papers, sharpen these pencils with a manual pencil sharpener, carry this big heavy basket of items, deliveries to the office, all of those things. Those are ways that you can call out on that child, ask them for help, and make them feel special, so it doesn't feel like, well, why am I the only kid in the class right now who needs to do, a wall push-up? It doesn't feel like discipline, it feels like a special opportunity. But break time activities are also a really great thing for the whole class. So if you notice the whole class getting a little antsy, or even if you want to build these in as just transitions between activities, break time activities that allow for the entire class to get that proprioceptive and vestibular input will benefit everybody. Some ways that you can do that in just fun activities are doing animal walks, like bear walks, crab walks, frog jumps. Again, pushing down the doorway or pushing up the wall, doing chair push-ups, where the kiddo scoots their little bottom off the chair and then is able to do some push-ups right in front of the chair using their hands behind them. Jogging or skipping or stomping in place, ripping paper or cardboard, catching a large ball or a pillow, doing some yoga moves, some dance moves, blowing bubbles, relay races with heavy objects, like a textbook, or maybe pushing a laundry basket of different toys into the toy closet. Theraputty and Play-Doh. These are all great break time activities that give their bodies that deep pressure and some movement. In addition, if for those kiddos who are at home, it's also really important to give those kiddos the opportunity to have some movement exercises that allow them to take a break, especially kiddos who are doing NTI for many hours connected to a screen. These kiddos need a break where they are stepping away from their computer and are able to light up that prefrontal cortex by giving their bodies some movement. So you see a couple of different activities here. We've got some resources on just brain breaks, resources on different sensory exercises you can do with your kiddos, outside activities. And so I've found, again, that voice and choice piece to be really helpful. So if you just want to build in, this is going to be our transition from one activity to another, or this is going to be our reward that we get after we've completed these 3 activities, but you get to choose. Putting them on popsicle sticks, cutting up these pieces of paper and putting them in a jar and letting them surprise choose, just picking one. Any time where a kiddo gets to say, this is what I want, it just helps build up the compliance with that activity. Next, we're going to be going into seated positioning. And seated positioning is just so important because, again, it's one of those ways that we can turn on the proprioceptive system and help cue the brain to know I need to be listening. It helps turn on and alert the brain, but also it helps that child to feel stable, helps build up those core muscles that are so essential for good handwriting, for dexterity. And so, as silly as it may sound, or as ancillary as it may sound, seated positioning is a really important piece that we need to be considering day in and day out in our classrooms. So how do I size a child to a desk? Well, the key is going to be that 90-90-90 rule, which is going to be looking at their torso to their hip. We want to see a 90-degree angle, as we can see in the picture on the left of the child who's sitting at the desk. We want their knees to be at a 90-degree angle. So that's going to be contributing to chair height. Is that chair too high or too low for them? That's going to influence whether they're at that 90-degree angle. And then we want the ankles to be also able to be at a 90-degree angle. So you might be thinking, well, I have a bunch of different kiddos who are all different sizes, but we don't have the ability to get a bunch of different desks and chairs that are the right size for them. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can make some adaptations that don't cost a lot of money. Again, I have a picture of a kiddo who's sitting and looking at a computer, because it's really important for those kiddos who are sitting and looking at a computer all day. These things affect attention, postural control, stability, and fine motor, as we all mentioned before. Some little clues to be looking at to see whether you need to address their positioning. Kiddos who are standing up while they're working, swinging or kicking their feet, it's a pretty good sign that that ankle's not at a 90-degree. A desk that's resting on their thighs, so we have a kiddo who's too tall in this chair. Kiddos who are wrapping their ankles around the chair legs, looking for that additional support, or a child who isn't able to sit with their back against the chair and feet on the floor. So what do I do when my students' feet don't touch the floor? Well, as teachers, as educators, it is our responsibility to do our very best to put children in furniture that fits them. And so if there is other furniture that is available, great, go for it. If that furniture is adjustable in any way, then rely on the help of your custodian and see if you can figure out how to adapt that chair or that desk to be able to make it fit that child the best. And this is kind of a nice thing about COVID, is a lot of times our kiddos are having a desk that's just for them. So But if not, then okay, how can I kind of try to keep similar sized kiddos in the same desk chairs um, and and other kiddos in their similar size groups? um, so a couple of options. Number one is something called bouncy bands. You can also use something like a Resist-A-Band. It's basically a really thick rubber band between two chair legs. And so this is a great way to provide some proprioceptive input for that kiddo who just likes to bounce their legs the whole time, or tap their feet. That child is able to put their feet and rest them on this Resist-A-Band, but be able to get a little bit of that resistive input, which provides some proprioceptive feedback and hopefully allows for a little better attention. But it also allows for those feet to not be swinging. And so that's a great way to get a little bit more of that security underneath their feet. Another way is to put just a pool noodle and attach it between the two chair legs, to give a little bit of just a higher surface. You can also build some supports out of wood that go around the chair legs, or the old classic, just putting a stack of telephone books or old books that you can put underneath the child's feet. A few inches makes such a big difference in helping a child to get comfortable. If the chair is too big, then you can just pull out those old pool noodles and boogie boards. This is a creative OT hack that just costs about $2. Cut the pool noodle to the height of the backing of the chair and then use packing tape to secure two pool noodles as posts to a foam boogie board in front of the pool noodles. It makes your chair about 4 inches smaller, and it will provide better back support. Another option is the cushion seat, and you may have seen this around before. It's often used for kids who are sensory seeking, but it can also be helpful when a chair is just a bit too big, and can support a child as they sit, allowing their arms to reach the desk more comfortably. So flexible seating with sensory in mind. If we have those kiddos who we can see they're a little bit more proprioceptive seeking, they're seeking that deep pressure input. We see kiddos who are vestibular seeking and they're constantly wiggling around in their chairs, or kiddos who are just tactile seeking, constantly fidgeting with things in their chairs. They can never keep still. Here's a few seating options that could be helpful for them. So for the proprioceptive kiddo, weighted lap pads are one of my favorites. They're something you can really easily make at home. I've even got a few options of how you can make them just using like old pillowcases and some duct tape. But basically, you just need enough weight to be able to lay on the lap. And if any of you have experienced the glorious relief of a weighted blanket, then you'll know what that feels like. It just helps kind of calm the body and allows that child to focus a little bit better. Book boats are also a really fun way to do this, especially if you don't need that kiddo to be sitting and riding, but just doing something that's a quiet activity. You can see each of these kiddos, what they've done is they've cut the top of that bin in half so that they have a surface to be able to read on or play with, but they're kind of cozied up in this little environment so that their body's all crunched in. And what that's doing is it's providing proprioceptive input to every one of those joints. Vestibular input for the kiddo who's just constantly wiggling or falling out of their chair. We've got the wobble stool. Again, going back to that pool noodle, putting a pool noodle on the seat this time, but putting it around the bottom so that they can kind of wiggle a little bit. Or of course the classic therapy ball. And those are all great ways. We're seeing more and more that active sitting is a really healthy way for the body and the brain to be seated for long periods of time. It's helping to, again, turn on that prefrontal cortex by allowing movement to engage longer spans of attention. And then the tactile input. If you are familiar with those fidget discs, they have little pokes in them, or if you need a lower cost option, just cutting a bunch of tennis balls in half and gluing them to the seat and to the back. It's just kind of providing some tactile input that allows the kiddo to feel that variation and hopefully not have to seek it out in ways that are distracting. Another great way, if you have a kiddo who's just constantly picking at things or feeling things with their fingers, is putting a little bit of Velcro on the underside of the desk so that they can feel probably that more pokey or rigid side of the Velcro. It's just when I need something to help me concentrate, I can do it in a discreet way. And last but not least is sensory strategies. So we're going to go to some of those old tips and tricks that we have for your classroom that will just help you pull in some of these sensory tools to just an everyday environment. So again, the 7 types of sensory are proprioceptive, vestibular, tactile, auditory, visual, olfactory, and oral. This is a great resource that I have used with many teachers, and we just put it together to help give kind of a toolbox, if you will, for what do I go to first if I have a child who needs to sit at their desk for a period of time, but that's often a difficult spot, or we're working on reading, but that's really hard for them. We're working on recess, but they have that's often a time where the most behaviors come out. These are just a couple of different tips and tricks that we tend to find ourselves recommending the most. And then on the right side, it's broken down by auditory, visual, tactile, vestibular, proprioceptive, and oral and olfactory strategies. So again, just a great resource that you can print out and have available to you. So let's start with the classic handwriting or tabletop activities. So this is something that you want to work on with your kiddo. You need them to be seated at a seat and working at a table. And we're going to be probably working a little bit on how they're grasping the pencil, how they're forming those shapes or letters. So if we're looking for how do I provide this child with some proprioceptive input, this is a kiddo who's seeming a little bit clumsy possibly, who maybe is making those letters with really strong force with their pencils, or is seeking out just that proprioceptive input by being really rough on things. Consider having them write on a slant board. A slant board provides a couple of benefits. One is it's bringing those arms closer to their eyes so that we see less of that leaning on the desk and breaking that 90-degree angle at the hips. But it's also allowing for a little bit more just proprioceptive input as we have something to work against that's just closer to our hand. Writing on a vertical surface is also another great way to get some proprioceptive input. Working on handwriting, but just as we have a little bit more gravity that we're working against, it naturally builds in that higher proprioceptive input. Vestibular input for the kiddo who's always super wiggly whenever we're working on handwriting exercises, or just an active kiddo. Allow them to act out an idea or a story before writing. Let them get some of those wiggles out. Allow them to write in different positions, under the desk, laying down. Those are some great ways to be able to provide some vestibular input. Tactile seeking kiddos, the ones who just love getting messy, getting their hands on things, fidgets. Consider having them write on different textures, writing in a sand tray, writing with their finger in paint, writing in shaving cream. For kiddos who are auditory seekers, allow them to listen to a story on headphones before they're answering questions, or possibly listen to music while they're working on handwriting. Kiddos who are seeking that visual input, who are constantly liking to watch that spinning and really fascinated with colors and pictures, consider having them writing in different colored writing utensils. And in the same vein, kiddos who are seeking olfactory, scented markers are a great way to catch their attention. So even if you notice, I don't have a kiddo who's really highly ranked in any of these from our questionnaire, but I like some of these ideas. These can be a great way to add just some variety to your school day, regardless of the sensory processing challenges they might have. Quiet activities. So when you need a child to be working on something quietly, that's pretty difficult for this age group. So how do we give them the sensory input they need so that we're not tempted to make some of those unnecessary vocalizations? Proprioceptive input, weighted lap pads, laying on the floor, sitting on knees in that position that I talked about before to avoid the W sitting are some great ways to provide that proprioceptive input. This is also where I really love that boat bin idea, where we're kind of giving them a small cuddly space to work in, allowing for all that joint movement. If we need to provide some vestibular input for a kiddo during a quiet time activity, allow them to sit in some various different positions, lying, sitting on the floor, crashing into pillows on a bean bag, and allow them again some purposeful movement before or during the quiet activity, acting out whatever they're reading about, or giving them some sort of finger play to play along with. Giving some fidget toys is a great way to give their hands something to do while they're doing the quiet activity. Auditory input, letting them listen to quiet music or have some headphones, some white noise or background noise for all the kiddos. Turning off the lights and giving a mini flashlight to look at items with is a fun way to kind of engage the visual system, but also to kind of allow that child to not have to get so distracted by what's going on in the background. And then oral, chewing gum, sucking on candies, chewing on a crunchy snack are always great ways. Okay, how about walking in line? Is this a challenging part of the day for any of your classes? Whether it's walking in from carpool or going out to the playground, or if you change locations for lunchtime, this can often be a time where a lot of behaviors come up. Some kiddos are seeking that auditory input, so they're making more noises, they're making funny sounds. Some kiddos are seeking the tactile input, so they're touching their friends. Some kiddos are seeking the proprioceptive input, so they're leaning against the wall as they're walking down, or they're walking really loudly. So what can we do to provide some sensory input to help these transitions? Well, if that kiddo is a kiddo who's seeking proprioceptive input, and I even like to do this with the whole class, build that in. So have them, when we're outside and we can, stomp like elephants as loud as you can. And let's even see if we can do it in unison, building in a little bit of that auditory piece. I like to do this a lot during the winter time. We do a little paper plate ice skating. It's a real cheap activity, but you just give each child 2 paper plates and have them skate along the carpet with those paper plates, using them like they're ice skates. Give that child special jobs by being the door holder or carrying the teacher's backpack. Those are some really special ways that you can get that kiddo to be able to feel like they have a special role that day, but also giving them some proprioceptive input. And you might know just the kiddos who need to have those jobs. Auditory input. If you have certain kiddos who like to create a lot of auditory noise, a lot of auditory stimulation by talking and singing and shouting, and then possibly some other kiddos who really avoid all that auditory stimulation and dislike the sounds and the kind of ruckus of getting from one location to another. Some of these exercises can be helpful. So going on a listening scavenger hunt, having each child be quiet as we're walking because we're listening. And so you might start off by saying, I want you to raise your hand if you hear the sound of a bird. I want you to raise your hand as soon as you hear the sound of a child sneeze. I want you to raise your hand as soon as you hear the sound of a toilet flush. Or have that child think of 3 things that they can hear as they move from one location to another, and then when they get to that next location, report what they heard. doing a whisper song. So if it's possible for all the children to whisper and shout together, doing a song that you can do at different levels of volume, but when we're outside, we're going to do it super, super loud, and when we're inside, we're going to whisper it really, really soft. Doing a name song where you are calling out each child's name, and so not singing it together, just a teacher-led song, so that every time that child's name is called, they get to come to the front of the line. But hopefully everyone needs to be listening, because that's the only way they'll know when their name is called. Tactile, a classic favorite, is the holding a rope, putting a bunch of knots on that rope so each child has a knot to hold on to, or some fun little item. That is an awesome way to get everyone from one place to another in some semblance of a line. Having the kiddos squeeze a leprechaun or a lightning bug or something in your hand, putting something imaginary in your hand, and don't let it go. You have to hold it really tightly. This gives us some proprioceptive input, but also gives those little hands that want to fidget and touch other people something to do. And then again, hands in pockets, hands on hips. Giving those hands a job or a place to be can help those kiddos who tend to be tactile seekers. The last place we're going to talk about some sensory tips is mask wearing, because I know that it's a really it's a popular topic right now, considering all the masks that we have to wear. I know every school is different on whether this age group needs to wear masks or not, but a few tips for you. So for kiddos who are just sensitive to the mask because of how it feels tactily, so they might just be constantly messing with the ear loops, moving it around their face, scratching it on their face. These are a couple of options. A lot of kids who are tactile sensitive do better with all cotton masks. So there's a company called Joa Love that sells 100% cotton masks. There's also a few that are sold at Target. I think Old Navy has some. So those are some really great tips to try. Then cord locks. A lot of times one of the most irritating pieces of the mask is just the behind the ears. I know it is for me. So especially if that mask is poor fitting, not only is it not working as well, it's just kind of annoying. So these cord locks are really cheap, and you can even make one out of just some rubber bands, but just a way to make it a little bit more secure of a fit. And that can go a long way for those sensory sensitive kids. So if you just notice that kiddo has their mask isn't fitting super well that day, having some of these in the classroom could be a way to just help readjust it for the time being. Other ways for parents to consider is if the kid just is irritated by it being behind their ears, there's some extenders that you can get that kind of stretch back those ear loops behind their ears and kind of makes it more of a headband. Or buttons. So now you can find these fun like headbands that come around the head, as well as hats, and you can loop the ear loops onto a button on the hat or the headband instead of on your ears. So it's just a couple of creative ways that people have come up with to avoid the irritation of the ear loops. If your kiddo is super tactily sensitive and they just don't like it in front of their face, or you notice that kiddo is just having difficulty relating with you because of how this is covering so much of your facial expression, there's a couple of options. There's something called the social mask that's made by Fun and Function, and it basically creates a little window right there around your mouth. That's a great way for kiddos to be able to see what you're saying, but also the expressions you're making. Face shields are another great way. I know there's a lot of variability on the thought effectiveness of face shields, and there's a couple of great companies. Little Lives PPE PediaShield, that's made by doctors with medical grade plastic. Third Kindness is similar to that, and I think a group called Shield Pals that makes them into little fun animal faces. So again, a great way to be able to show those facial expressions. This can be really important when you're working with kiddos with autism, and especially when you're trying to teach some of those social skills, to be able to see your face. And eyeglass fogging. If you have kiddos who are wearing eyeglasses, there's a lot of great options out there online that you can find of ways to keep their glasses from fogging up too badly. But one of the easiest I know, this doesn't work for our tactile kiddos, but it's just putting a little bit of medical tape along the top of the mask to seal off that little window that allows all the hot, steamy air to come out. And spray the glasses with some anti-fog swim goggle spray. That can make a big difference as well. And then the last piece I have on masks is just the smell factor. So I know myself personally, I just put on a mask the other day after going out to a Mexican restaurant, and sure enough, the next day my mask smelled like Mexican food, which is just not the most pleasant smell you want to be smelling when you're running into the grocery store. So again, reminding those parents to wash those masks every night in hot water with unscented detergent is really important for those kiddos who are a little bit more sensitive smells wise. For kiddos who might be seeking smells, the ones who are smelling everything that's in sight, or who just have a particular smell that they love, putting a little bit of essential oil on the corners of the mask, not on the skin, but inside the mask, can be a great way to just give them something special. But again, make sure parents try this at home before sending them into the school day for the day with this. And lastly, on the social skill, or on the masks, I find social stories to be a great way, as we're in this complicated season of coronavirus, to just explain what's going on. There's some complex things that little minds are having to comprehend and figure out where they feel emotionally on the new information they're given. And so social stories can be a great way to just normalize, but also give the information that's necessary in a supportive and a reassuring way. So we've written a collection of social stories, again, at that shandyclinic.com/resources, on just what is coronavirus, what do I do when I have cabin fever, why aren't we going anywhere, what do I do when I feel worried, and how do I wash my hands. As we wrap up today, I just cannot thank you enough for being a teacher, a caregiver, a support service individual who cares enough about the kiddos that you work with to put in the time to learn about how their little brains process sensory information and ways that you can adapt the environment or your method of teaching in order to help best facilitate their learning. But I want to make a distinction as we close just on accommodations versus sensory integration therapy. What we have talked about today are accommodations. And so these are ways that we are changing the environment, changing the assignment, changing the method of instruction, but ultimately not changing the student. And so we're trying to change what we are offering in order to best facilitate the learning of that child. But if you notice that that child is still struggling or would just benefit from seeing these changes not just affect your classroom, but all classrooms or all areas of life, then they're going to benefit the most from working with an occupational therapist to change their actual brain through sensory integration therapy. An occupational therapist who's trained in this approach would be able to work with that child so that they're not seeking out auditory input as much as they were anymore, or so that they don't get so overwhelmed by tactile input that they don't like across the board. If you want to work with individuals like that, please consider reaching out to the Shandy Clinic. Again, you can find all of your information that you need on shandyclinic.com, and we'd love to work with you. Again, thank you for your time and for this presentation.